Okay, so this talk is divided in 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about why is this new movement needed after all? Which problem are we trying to tackle? What are we fighting against and what are we fighting for? In the second part, I'm going to talk about the solution. And then finally, in the third part, we'll properly get into the movement. Why is this movement different and what are our principles and our vision? And that said, let's get into it. I want to start this talk with a metaphor. I believe there's a monster. I call it the Dark Void. It's a very powerful entity. It seems to have taken over the whole world. However, it's a very strange monster. It's very hard to pin down. It has many shapes, many faces, and many names, which change from person to person depending on what is it that we fear most. When people look into the void, they see different things. Some people see the environmental crisis, others see oppression and discrimination, some see the loss of traditional values, stagnation, or institutional decay. But to me, when I looked into the void, it didn't appear like any of these things. Instead, the question that came up is, why is it that human beings being so creative and imaginative, and most of us actually being quite pro-social and cooperative, then why is it that we've ended up here? And so I made it my mission to look deep into the void. What does the void hide? What lies on the other side? And what I found was really surprising. Because on the other side of the void, there isn't death or darkness. There wasn't some ugly secret about the true nature of humanity that we try to bury down, a scary truth that no one dares to speak about. Instead, what I found was the opposite. The void isn't dark, it's actually colorful and full of life. And it's only that it turns dark when we disconnect from that essence of life. And now I know that this might sound very abstract, so let me demonstrate this to you with a little exercise. If you feel comfortable, now you can close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to think back to one of the most meaningful moments of your life. Try to really tune in to the feelings of how you felt back then. What is it that you were paying attention to? Which sort of way of living felt possible? What was it that was so beautiful and meaningful about that time? Try to really feel that feeling. Go deep into it. Okay. And now, when you felt that, let's do this again. But now, think about the most meaningful moment that you've experienced in this past year. Try to go really deep and tune in to the feelings of how you felt at the time. What is it that you were paying attention to? Which way of living felt possible from that time? What is it that felt so meaningful and so special about that moment? Try to go really deep into that feeling. Okay, and once you've got that, let's do this one more time. Now, think about the most meaningful moment that you've experienced in the past week. It doesn't have to be any grandiose moment. It can be something small. It also doesn't necessarily have to be a happy or easy moment. Sometimes we take a lot of meaning from challenging or difficult experiences. But try to find this moment of your past week and try to go deep into that feeling. What was it that felt so meaningful, so magical about it? What exactly was it that you were paying attention to that made this moment feel special? Which sort of way of living felt possible? Which new world felt possible? Try to go really deep into that feeling. And once you have it, you can open up your eyes again. Now, all these experiences, all these moments might be very different from each other. However, what they all have in common is that they tap into a very fundamental source of life. This is what in my work I call the sacred, which, under my definition, it doesn't mean some sort of static characteristic that some things represent because an authority said so, but rather the underlying quality that all these feelings have in common. In this sense, the sacred is a quality, not a thing. It's the quality of connectedness, relevance, beauty, and meaning that all these different experiences have in common, and that if we really pay attention to, we can surface up. Of course, the sacred is not a static quality either. It can manifest in many different ways. For example, maybe you may have felt it in the majestic beauty of the natural world, or in front of a truly touching piece of art. Maybe it comes in that sense of purpose that we feel when we're being immersed in deeply meaningful work, or in that sense of being a close and tight squad that we feel after an adventure with our friends. Sometimes we feel it in the most grandiose ways, like when we feel the excitement of pushing the boundaries of what humanity is capable of, whether it's by expanding the frontier of knowledge or by reaching for the stars. Many other times, we feel it in the most ordinary ways, like when we're listening to the right song at the right time and we just feel grateful of being alive. Sometimes it can manifest in sweet and touching ways, like when we feel truly seen in a deeply intimate moment with our partners. Other times, it manifests in spicier or darker ways, like when we let ourselves go wild in a dark techno night. All these different manifestations are what we call values or sources of meaning. Meaning, the feelings of meaning that can be precisely named, well-defined, and purposely addressed by others. Together, they make up this universe of meaning, made of all these different values, which represent that quality that I call the sacred. Now, I don't think it's any stretch to say that a good life is one that's aligned with our sources of meaning, and that is full of opportunities to connect with our own sense of sacred, whatever that may be. And not just in this fake, just be happy sort of way. No, in a way that still challenges and makes us grow to become the person that we really want to become. However, in this plane of reality, we're not just light beings that have sources of meaning or values. Instead, if we want to live by them, we need containers. Essentially, containers are the vehicle, whether that's the space, the group, the practice, the object, the vibe, through which we express value. For example, the value of togetherness can manifest in many different ways. Perhaps in the sense of brotherhood that we feel when we're part of a football club or in a fire group DM with our friends. Maybe we feel it in the army, or in a men's work circle, or perhaps in a local political community. In the same way, the value of transcendence, that feeling of being deeply connected to a reality much bigger than myself, can manifest in many different ways too. Perhaps a classical one is in the church, but many people can also feel this feeling in front of nature, or deep in meditation, or while practicing tantric sex, or perhaps with the right combination of drugs. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we need containers to navigate through life, as they allow us to practice a certain value. However, with containers comes a problem: the over-identification with containers. The church is a classic example of this. As a space, it should be an amazing place to practice the value of transcendence and connecting with this higher reality. But very often, this gets obscured with the many social norms and daily realities that are present in the church today, and that make it harder to connect to this value of transcendence. And this doesn't just happen at the micro scale, but also at the macro, which presents another whole set of problems. For example, many religions start out by having a great insight into the source of the sacred. At smaller scales, it's very easy for these religions to maintain a very clear and direct connection to that source. However, as they grow and time passes, it's very easy for these values to get obscured by the doctrine, an interpretation of the doctrine, and then the interpretation of the doctrine, which leads to all forms of institutional decay and social dysfunction that have very little to do with the values that the religion was initially based on. A similar thing happened with liberalism. It's crazy because liberalism started out as this beautiful project that, in theory, aimed to prevent that. It started with a very real and very important insight: to free men from the burden of oppressive social norms and dogma so that they could pursue happiness on their own terms, their own version of a good life. At the beginning, this mostly meant being able to live in whichever way you want to live, which at the time meant being able to own and work on your own land, read whichever books you want to read from the public library, and then come together and vote. And this is what constituted this first variant of Jeffersonian liberalism that revolved mostly around household goals. At some point, as the Industrial Revolution kept paying off, those household goals grew to include not only farm work, but also being able to acquire all these new functional appliances that you needed in order to participate in modern society. But then, things took another turn. Economists and industrialists often worried that once the basic needs of modern citizens were covered with things such as household appliances, cars, and functional clothing, they wouldn't be able to keep selling them stuff. They feared that factories would then have to shut down and the economy would enter a recession. And so, another form of liberalism came up, one in which being free to pursue happiness on your own terms didn't mean getting your needs covered, but being able to self-express yourself through your consumption choices. And since people have many different tastes, we have to cater to all of them with different variations of the same products. What we call now long-tail liberalism, and this is what gave us shopping malls, Walmart, and Amazon. And then things took another darker turn. At some point, economists realized that people kept indulging in behavior, in preferences that weren't necessarily representative of what people actually wanted. They kept indulging in fast food, fast fashion, and clickbait content. However, since they thought it bad for them to try to modify this behavior top down, like what China is doing now, they just decided to go with it. To go with people's revealed preferences, even if they knew that that wasn't a good indicator of how people actually wanted to live. And is this what essentially gave rise to this new era of social media and capitalism, where essentially anything goes, and being free just means being free to indulge in whatever is it that you want to click on, whatever is it that you want to buy. And it's this apparently innocuous process what has led us to the point where we are today, where the market keeps justifying feeding endless, toxic, meaningless products to people under the basis that, hey, we're just giving people what they want. But of course, this sort of insidious justification only works if you have an extremely shallow definition of want. One that for sure has very little in common with what the fathers of liberalism envisioned when they dreamt of a society made up of free men. Now, what's going on? What really is the problem here? Well, I believe this is happening because of a process of dilution, where meaning and truth get obscured. The problem is that while we start with some real value, some real source of insight, a source of meaning that we want to guard, protect, and scale, this value, this meaning, often gets lost through distortion by mistaking the quality of sacredness, the values behind this container, for the container itself. This is also what I call the rise of bullshit, as with each new layer of over-identification with the container, we'll lose signal and we'll lose truth. It's like that telephone game that we used to play when we were kids, where we started with something real and important, but over time, that something gets diluted and distorted until it's no longer recognizable. It's like that Buddhist saying of pointing at the moon but looking at the finger, but on steroids. And it's this particular process that makes the void that's so colorful and full of life gradually turn dark. It gets worse though. I believe this problem also exacerbates ideological conflict, along with the coordination problems and power struggles that come with it. And I know that this is a big claim, but let's look into it. Let's take a look at these two groups of people. On one hand, we have Trump supporters, and on the other, social justice activists. In our current social climate, the mere mention of one group to the other is enough to set up a rage rampage. And I believe a big part of this hatred is because we're over-identifying with their container, whether that's their political party, their social identity, or the policies that they stand behind. Now, under our current social setup, it's impossible to imagine them having a normal conversation, and much less coordinating together to solve big problems. And this is the reason why it feels like the only way to get what you want out of life, to be able to live the way that you really want to live, is by fighting the oversight and gaining power over them. However, what if our conversation was less fixated on their containers and more on the sources of meaning behind those containers? Well, I believe we'd have a very different situation. For example, behind Trump supporters, we can probably find values like caring about life in overlooked small communities, what we know as small-town America, or honoring the dignity of blue-collar values, or protecting those in my immediate community. And behind social justice activists, we can probably find values like caring for marginalized communities, or honoring the wisdom of diverse voices and experiences, or creating spaces for vulnerability. Now, I really believe that if our social, political, and democratic conversation was to revolve more around those values, rather than the containers that these tend to be manifested into, I believe we'd have a completely different conversation. For starters, you might not share these values, but they are much easier to empathize with. But also because even when we have different values, I believe it's much easier to negotiate a container when we're clear about our values rather than if we're only talking about candidates or policies. For example, in this case, the top value for both of these groups is about caring about communities that they both believe to be overlooked or marginalized. And the second value is about honoring a certain type of experience, a certain way of living that both groups believe it's important and often dismissed by the mainstream. And while it's impossible to imagine a social justice activist and a Trump supporter getting along, it's much easier to imagine coordination amongst people that share values like care for their community or making space for voices outside of the mainstream, even if these manifest in slightly different ways. And this is why I believe that behind any container, no matter how outrageous it might initially seem, there's always a signal of wisdom that we should always try to find out and listen to. Now, perhaps some of you might be feeling skeptical. You might be like, yeah, sure, that's cute and it might work in your sacred space fantasy land, but in the real world, people are power hungry and aggressive and driven by a desire of domination. And here's the thing, you're right, it's true. These impulses do exist and they're not going away anytime soon. However, I believe there's a better way of dealing with them than what we currently have. For example, I really believe that there is something that is also precious behind those instincts. Something that for many of us is actually meaningful and not just a bug in our genetic code that we should try to eliminate. One expression of this can be found in the value of connection to our primal nature. That rush of energy and libidinal power that we feel when we really connect to our primal drives. I believe that it's possible to see through this drive clearly and to create containers that are specially designed as spaces where we can safely express these values. For example, there's people that might express their desire for domination and submission through BDSM, people that might express their desire for darkness in techno raves, or maybe the desire for aggression can be found in martial arts. The desire for power, it can be channeled through the Star Trek life, and that letting go and being wild, perhaps in ecstatic dancing. I believe that if we create containers that are able to safely channel this value, instead of repressing it or pretending that it doesn't exist, would see that this darker aspect of human nature becomes much easier to manage, in a way that it doesn't so easily spill everywhere else. Now, what's my point here? My point is not that there is some sort of magical solution that if we all adopted would magically solve all the problems of the world. Don't trust anyone who tries to sell you that. Red flag. No, my point is that most of our social environments, social interactions, and systems more broadly are focused on the wrong part of ourselves. We put way too much emphasis on the container rather than the reasons why we feel drawn to these containers in the first place. Our sources of meaning, the ways we truly want to live. And it's this overt fixation with containers which causes meaning to degrade over time and artificially inflates rivalry and power games. A trend that will later amplify by designing large-scale systems based on this mistake, whether it's organizations, ideologies, economies, or algorithms. And this is what makes the current moment especially delicate, because the truth is that we've never had completely values-aligned, bullshit-free ideologies. An over-identification with containers is a problem as old as time. So this hasn't changed. What is new, though, is how high the stakes are now, because our civilization has become enormously powerful. As is often said, we have the power, but not the wisdom of the gods. And this is why the question of which sort of signal are we amplifying matters now more than ever. Will we amplify systems designed for the most shallow or the most sacred part of ourselves? Do we want a world that optimizes for paper clips or for meaning? I know the situation might feel very intense, but I don't believe we're doomed to the darkness. I believe there's a way out. We've got a special weapon. This weapon is no short of a superpower, at least as far as human skills go. It's like a very powerful and very sophisticated bullshit detector. It's like some sort of special glasses that if you put them on, they allow you to see straight through the fog of the void. We call this power values articulacy, which is the ability to be really clear about sources of meaning. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, first of all, because people can't advocate for changes they don't have the language for. Just imagine going back and sitting in a medieval table and someone starts talking about how he is a sovereign individual and we need to have more diversity at the table. Not only would it be incredibly hard to come up with these ideas because we just didn't have the frameworks or the mental models to think about them. Even if someone did, well, it would still be incredibly hard for that person to be taken seriously. In the same way, today, if we're in a meeting, it's completely commonplace to say how we should make more space for women or diverse voices. But if we were about to say that some sort of product or policy that we're trying to roll out is oppressive towards certain sources of meaning, well, would look as weird as if we were trying to discuss diversity at the medieval table. And it's really sad because today we're in this situation where we literally have no words for the things that really matter to us. We can be incredibly precise about our goals and our tastes, but when it comes to values, we often end up with these completely vague and shallow empty statements that we end up putting on corporate boards. And again, this is why we so often get lost in a notion of empty containers. Because we keep coming up with these grand, beautiful visions for how to change the world, but since we lack the language to truly articulate and design for what's so precious about those visions, we end up turning diversity into this empty checklist that objectifies the people that we intend to help, or end up justifying that the casting of a vote is proof enough that men are being heard. But what if we were able to be really precise about our sources of meaning? And not just in these incredibly vague terms that we so often use, but what if we were able to very specifically point out to the ultimate thing, the ultimate quality that really matters to us, with a refinement that a sommelier can talk about wine or a designer can distinguish between the subtleties of colors? And what if this literacy was as widespread as the capacity we have to think about our goals and dreams? Not only this, imagine if it was common sense to understand humans in those terms, as people who have sources of meaning that they want to live by, rather than soulless automatons that need to be manipulated through incentives in order to get things done. I believe a radical new world of possibility would open up, in the same way that the understanding of men as reason-driven, utility-maximizing sovereign individuals opened the door to envisioning and designing all the institutions that shape the modern age, like markets and democracies. And this is where I wanted to get to, because having values articulacy is really cool, but we gotta do something with it. We want the revolution. Because here's the thing, if you're well trained in your ability to see meaning clearly, it will also be much easier to you to evaluate whether certain containers are good at supporting values or if they are oppressing them. This is what constitutes the second part of the superpower. The capacity to be really clear about sources of meaning so that we are able to better evaluate, design, and redesign containers for them. This can mean different things. Maybe it's the capacity to create radically new containers. Other times it will be redesigning containers that we have. And sometimes it will just mean caring and maintaining for those containers we already have and like, so that they don't lose their essence under the circumstances of a changing world. You can do this at really grand scales. There's people that have learned this superpower and are now applying it in places such as Twitter, Google, or Facebook. We're also starting a research network where we're looking into how to align markets and algorithms with values. But you can also do this at smaller scales, like around your community, your friends, or family. There's people that have learned this superpower and are now applying it to change dating in the community in order to try to move away from the drag of modern dating apps. And finally, you can also do this on yourself. Getting in touch with our own source of meaning can be an incredibly powerful process. Which containers, whether it's containers that you set for yourself or that society has set for you, no longer support your values? Which new ones could you create? Essentially, what this superpower does is that it gives us the ability to create meaning on purpose, no matter at which scale. It turns us into God mode container designers who can create containers that have a very clear and direct connection with our sources of meaning. And here's the thing. I believe that behind all these problems that we see in the dark void, there are sources of meaning that are being oppressed by bad containers. And I believe that if we got in touch with these sources of meaning, it would be much easier to coordinate and try to solve them. Okay, so now that I've told you about our cause and our proposed solution, I want to tell you about the movement and why I believe this can be a very different movement than most of the ones we're used to. Why? Well, let's see. If you've been paying any attention to the whole changing the world business, you probably notice how it suffers greatly from these three trends. First, the message. Why is everyone doing this? Why is everyone doing this non-stop? No matter whether it's climate change, social dynamics, tech hijacking your mind, or AI risk, it feels like we've normalized that the enlightened thing to do is to spread fear and guilt. And hey, I get it. I'm by no means oblivious to all the problems facing the world. But here's the thing. While it's true that some of this is needed in order to criticize and deconstruct, I don't think that this endless stream of criticism and fear-mongering is the energy or the messaging that works in order to construct towards something good. And also, because here's the thing. If your movement is built on this, well, no wonder that this is what it does to your people. Again, why is it that we've normalized that most of the movements trying to change the world and do good are actually breaking such earnest, well-hearted, and often young people? Is this really the emotional place from which we can actually build towards something good? When has ever something good come out from these? And finally, the aesthetics. Oh god, the aesthetics. This is a very sad trend. It's actually not just in movement building, it's everywhere. And, you could be forgiven to think that this aesthetic tragedy is simply because people have bad taste or because we have lost the capacity for aesthetic appreciation. But no, don't let yourself be fooled. This is because we've been mediocrity built by utilitarianism. You see, under utilitarianism, even when we have the best intentions, it's so easy to end up reducing everything that's beautiful and meaningful and sacred about the world into little utility metrics. And when we do this, when we separate beauty from utility, we end up creating this world of extremely shallow beauty and sterile and lifeless utility. And this is how we end up with this. So I want to change this. I really, really want to change this. And not only because this is not the right way to build a better world, but also because we deserve better. Because if you can't build a beautiful movement, you can't build a beautiful world either. So this is what I want to do. Instead of the gloom and doom, our movement is going to be founded on an apparently simple but very powerful principle: to help each other discover and bring to the world that which is most meaningful for us. I like this principle because it's anti-ideological. It doesn't presuppose that there is one right thing that everyone should do and that we should roll up everyone to, and you're either on our team or against. Meaning is plural, and that is a beautiful thing. But it's not relativistic or nihilistic either. It's not about everyone doing whatever the fuck they want. No, beauty, goodness, and meaning, they are all real and very much worth pursuing. It's just that it takes a little bit more effort, a little bit more reflection to figure out what they really mean to you, rather than simply living by the containers that others set for you. But there's another, more personal reason for why I like this principle so much. And it's because the thing that puts at the center is not some sort of abstract ideal, but rather that magical quality that all these beautiful moments and experiences that we connected with during the first part of our talk have in common. Because this quality, this feeling, is something that we've all felt, even if it's only once. We've all felt those moments where we get a glimpse of something different, something beautiful, something true. And you see, for me, the biggest tragedy of humanity is not misaligned incentives, the original sin, not even the Buddhist universal suffering. No, for me, the biggest tragedy is a moment where we decided that this is not how ordinary life is supposed to feel like. That's the moment where we resigned ourselves to greatness. But what if we didn't? What if we refused to accept defeat? How different would the world be? How different would we feel? Because you see, before, I made fun of how all the gloom and doom was breaking people. But the truth is that we're all living under this, in some form or another. And most of the times without even being fully aware of it. And this is precisely because we've resigned to living in a way that isn't really aligned with what's most sacred to us. But what if we made it our duty to truly recapture that spark that really lights people up? To help people reconnect and bring to the world that which makes them feel most alive? I believe not only we would have a very different world, but also very different people. And now that we've got the message and we've got the vibe, can we create a container that feels as beautiful and full of life as the vision that we're trying to spread? Because here's the thing. I'm gonna do a little confession here, but I don't really come from activism and much less tech. Actually, my first loves were fashion, music, and film. And at some point, I moved away from them to more intellectual pursuits because they didn't really have the depth that I was looking for. But since then, my dream has always been to reconcile these two sides of myself. My dream has been to create a movement that truly unites artists and technologists, and not just as a cheap marketing move or as a strategic advantage, but because celebrating the beauty of life is an integral part of our vision. What if we were able to communicate these ideas with videos that, instead of being sad, dry explainers, have the sensibility and that coolness that we often find in film or in our favorite video clips? What if our events had the magical aura and the electricity that we often find in some of the best concerts? If other movements aren't doing this, it's not because it's impossible, but because no one cares enough about it. But I do. I care a lot. So this is the movement that Joe and I want to build. A movement that is driven by our love for life rather than a fear of death. And I know that given our current climate, perhaps this might feel like too big of an ask. But I really believe that existential hope works best, not when it feels the easiest, but when we need it most. So if you are as excited about this vision as we are, here's how you can help. As you've probably realized, this is a big vision, and we need lots of smart, capable people to help us build it. This is the organizational structure that we envision for this movement. At the top, there's a nonprofit, the Institute for Values Futures, that has a research arm looking into values in economies and in recommender systems. Here, we're looking for veterans in the machine learning and mechanism design fields to be principal investigators or research directors. Then there's the movement aspect, which is what I've just presented. For this, we envision something really special. We imagine it as having aspects of a city-by-city brand, like SoCycle, aspects of a local economy, and also of a social movement, like effective altruism or Extinction Rebellion. Here, we're looking for founders that have experience scaling membership-based communities, and also for movement builders. Finally, there's a school for social design that already exists, is fully functional, and it's ready to scale. You can apply here if you want to train how to be values articulate and how to design around sources of meaning. And there's a database of sources of meaning and practices. Joe made the first version, but in order to take it further, we need a chief of product. So if you know of anyone who'd be a perfect fit for any of these roles, please refer them to us. That is one of the main ways that you can help. Of course, we also welcome anyone who wants to help spread these ideas to the public, whether that's community and political organizers, artists, creatives, or other media makers, or anyone who wants to start a local chapter. And finally, we also have a Patreon for those of you who want to start supporting our work as we continue to gather energy and momentum for our movement. Any support here would be really appreciated.